and have had the opportunity to talk about an issue that I believe is important, and perhaps tell a story that I think you may have some interest in. So it's been a great meeting. It's my first exposure to NIAA, and it's a wonderful group that has diverse interests and a very sophisticated understanding of something that we all share, and that is the basic production of food in the United States. I was asked to talk about the precautionary principle, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Mark Walton did a masterful job yesterday giving a wonderful presentation talking about the principle and its application. My talk is really more about a case study, and I'll tell you the experience of one company as it has wrestled with the challenge of trying to introduce what we believe to be an innovative new technology. To be honest, as Glenn said, I've been in this business for 40 years, which number one makes me very old, but also our technology is neither so new or so innovative that I can claim that this is really cutting edge. The problem has really been the regulatory system as we try to move this technology through some sort of a regulatory paradigm. And that will be my story. The first written description of the precautionary principle goes back to a conference in Rio in 1992. It's been around longer than that, as Mark pointed out yesterday. But basically, it talks to the importance of protecting the environment, taking a precautionary approach. And there's an interesting context here where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage. Lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures. Sounds good. That phrase probably has done more to create havoc in introducing new and novel technologies, particularly in foods, than probably almost any other phrase in the history of the English language. When I gave them the title, I thought I was very clever, talking about precaution becoming paralysis. It turned out, not to my surprise, it wasn't so clever. Cass Sunstein, who's the former director of OIRA and who's now at the Harvard School of Law, formerly at Chicago, when he was at the University of Chicago, wrote a very compelling article, and in that he made the statement that's in red on your screen. The problem with the precautionary principle is not that it leads in the wrong direction, but if taken for all that it's worth, it leads in no direction at all. And that, I think, is a fundamental truth. Interestingly enough, when Mr. Sunstein was director of OIRA in the first Obama administration, although I think he personally had no problems with our technology, he did not maintain his activist stance with respect to the precautionary principle or the importance of moving new technology through the regulatory system. Subsequently, he's declined to comment on any matters that were pending in that first administration because he felt that it was inappropriate. So although there's a great intellect and a man of some judgment and experience who has firsthand knowledge of this, he's declined to comment, perhaps because of his political associations. The two fish that you see on the slide are sisters. They're the same age. They came from the same spawn. The fish in the foreground is a St. Johns River Atlantic salmon. The fish in the background is also a St. Johns River Atlantic salmon, but it has one additional gene. It has what we call the AquaBounty gene construct. That's a Chinook salmon growth hormone gene under the control of a promoter from another fish called the ocean pout. That's one gene out of maybe 30 or 40,000 structural genes in the animal. It's 4,000 base pairs out of approximately 4 times 10 to the 9th base pairs in the animal's genome. If you do the arithmetic, that's something around 1/10,000th of 1% of its total DNA. That's less genetic change than you might find in a normal sexual mating in almost any species, not excluding Atlantic salmon. But yet that one gene, a fish gene, a salmon gene, nonetheless, expressed in a salmon, has raised an enormous controversy in the United States and has been the subject of a now more than 19-year regulatory review. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, and I'll explain that in a moment, but it is a fact that for two reasons, the lack of a regulatory paradigm and the eventual decision on a regulatory paradigm that has not resulted in an approval, you basically can get to that 19-year regulatory timeline. What does that one gene do? It confers what we call the rapid growth phenotype. You can see the growth curves. The AquaBounty salmon reaches 500 grams in about 220 days. The sister, the full sib, genetically identical except for that one gene, takes twice as long. If you look at the slope of those lines in the early part of that growth cycle, the growth rate is 4 to 6 times, and sometimes higher, than the unmodified Atlantic salmon. Again, full sib, genetically identical except for one single gene. So that's what it does. What does that mean? It means that this fish can go to market size in about half the time. If you're feeding fish, that's a big deal because your biggest component is feed. If I told you that this fish is also 20% better in converting feed into food protein, that's an even bigger deal because to get to the same weight, you consume 20% less feed. And remember, you get there in half the time. There's one other piece of information that's also been published. The AquaBounty salmon has about a 5% better nitrogen retention. Protein nitrogen is probably the most expensive feed component, as everyone here knows, whether you're feeding cats or dogs or horses or cattle or pigs or salmon. And if you have a 5% better nitrogen retention and a 20 to 25% better feed conversion, you have a real economic advantage in feeding that animal. And you have an animal that now, instead of being grown in net pens and in sea cages in extensive operations, can be grown in land-based, confined, contained aquaculture systems. Something that I hope to persuade you will be the way of the future. The gene itself is a Chinook salmon growth hormone gene, and that's the construct. It's very simple, small piece of DNA introduced into the developing embryos now over 24 years ago. In 1989, the first founder animal was created. And we've bred it now for more than 13 generations using simple Mendelian genetics, classical breeding. We do some interesting little tricks, but basically the founder fish was created in 1989. We have a 14-generation pedigree on our animal, on our product. We have a 24-plus year history of studying that fish. It's arguably the most studied fish in history and arguably probably the most pedigreed food that may be able to be served to Americans. The origin of the regulatory process goes back a long ways, but in 1986, the Coordinated Framework was published, and you've all heard of it. The Coordinated Framework basically said, regardless of the mode of production, if the food is the same, it should be regulated the same. And that sort of transformative policy has been sustained throughout the years and is the basis for policy in the current FDA and currently for ag products and USDA and EPA. That has been the basis for the regulation of genetically modified crops, and as you know, today it's impossible, almost impossible, to have a soybean or anything prepared from a soybean that has not been genetically modified. The same can be true of corn, papaya, sugar beets, and a long list of other products. So genetic changes using modern technology, modern molecular biology, are a daily part of the American diet and now a daily part of the world diet. They're perhaps even being more widely adopted in developing countries and developing economies to meet global food security needs and to meet production requirements and basically helping to feed the world. So in ag, the technology has been brought on. It's been used, it's been employed, and it's been successful. And I think many people have made this comment, but to my knowledge, there has not been one single instance in over 20 years of one single adverse human health event that's been associated with genetically modified crops. You can't say that about other aspects of agriculture, and I'll stop there, and I'll be glad to entertain questions and talk about that if you have an interest. But the record of this technology is unblemished, and the contributions are significant. And as Mark pointed out the other day, the opportunities now with perhaps climate change, perhaps global warming, and global conditions for producing food augur well for the use of new technologies to improve productivity in drought-tolerant crops and in other opportunities both in plant and in animal agriculture to help meet the global food security requirements. Since 1986, there has only been one animal approved using the regulatory paradigm. And that product occurred in 2009, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Between the time of the issuance of the coordinated framework and the eventual approval of the atrin, the protein that was produced in that transgenic goat in 2009, there were stakeholder meetings, discussions, like-minded people meetings, a whole variety of meetings discussing the opportunities and how our nation should regulate the products of biotechnology as applied to food animals. Now, I've already told you that on the plant side and on the agricultural side, this process moved forward. The technology actually started in animals, and the early plant systems were clumsy. I can say that because I come from the animal side. Mark might wish to dispute that, but in the early days you were dealing with viruses, you were dealing with awkward transformation systems, and everyone, including all the people in my lab, thought, the animal applications of this technology are going to be adopted, people are going to realize how good they are, and they're powerful. Interestingly enough, we were stalled in a regulatory morass. It was discussed until it was painful. You talked about this until literally your hair hurt. And it was the same people with the same stories talking on a quarterly basis with the same stakeholders and the same regulators, and it just went on and on and on. And on the one side, you had the animal welfare people, you had the anti-technology people, you had the consumers union people, you had the environmentalists, and you had all of these other groups. Some of them had legitimate viewpoints, some of them just didn't like technology. On the other side, you had the animal health companies, you had people like me that were interested in bringing molecular biology and modern molecular genetics to food production, and a whole variety of characters, including regulators from our government, from USDA, from the FDA, and from a variety of interested parties. In 2008, this basically came to a head, because there was a company called GTC Therapeutics. Their name has subsequently changed, but they had an application on the human side of the FDA, and that application was to produce this human antithrombin A in the milk of a transgenic goat. That product was about to be approved by CBER. And CVM, the Center for Veterinary Medicine, took a look at this and said, wow, if they issue that approval and that product enters commerce, we will probably have lost the initiative on the regulation of genetically engineered animals, as they like to call them. And over a period of a few weeks, Guidance 187 popped out, which is on your screen, which had been in preparation for some time. And very shortly thereafter, there was a Veterinary Medical Advisory Committee meeting. The GTC Therapeutics people were called in. There was a quick review. There was a very quick VMAC and recommendation to approve, and the product was approved by CVM just before it was approved by CDER. So therein lies the genesis of the regulatory pathway. One could argue that it's regulatory turf, bureaucratic initiative, politics, whatever, but at least we had a system. And I'd been working for more than 10 years at that point trying to get a system. And we didn't care whether it was USDA, we didn't care if it was APHIS, we didn't care if it was the local postman, as long as we had a regulatory paradigm, because we believed it important to have a paradigm that people could have confidence and knowledge that the product had been adequately studied and reviewed both for food safety and environmental safety. And now we had a system. There was a guidance document and there was a regulatory path. It was to be regulated as a veterinary drug. There were a lot of people that said, that's crazy. It's not a drug, it's an animal, it's a living, breathing thing. But through a strained analogy and a strained construct, the FDA made the argument, and basically that became the regulatory paradigm. Now, let me switch gears briefly. Atlantic salmon are an exclusively farmed species. There are wild Atlantic salmon, but they are all recreational fisheries. The commercial fisheries for Atlantic salmon disappeared long ago. We overfished them, we destroyed their habitat, and we basically pushed the species to basically an all-farm species. So they're cultivated extensively in Norway, the south of Chile, England, the Faroe Islands, Scotland, and a variety of places around the world, including the Far East off the coast of China. So in Maine, the Atlantic salmon is actually an endangered species, and that's an important part of the story that I'm about to tell you. The Endangered Species Act of 1973, signed by President Nixon, was an important step forward to protect endangered species. That's a good thing. There was also another environmental law that was passed and also signed by President Nixon. Those of you who know him for Watergate can also blame him for NEPA and ESA. In the National Environmental Policy Act, which is the most litigated legislation on the books in the United States, the concept was that every federal agency had the responsibility for protecting the environmental consequences of any major decision. Going to the men's room is a major decision in any federal agency. So it basically affected everything. Excluded from this bill were the President, the Congress, and the federal courts. That's not terribly important for our purposes, but what is important is that NEPA is a law that's well-intentioned, and in fact it's a good law, but it's very vague. There are very few specific endpoints, and it's subject to a wide variety of interpretation, and it has been in the federal courts almost since its inception. Let me come back to AquaBounty salmon. Realizing that our product was a first-in-class, a pioneer, we sat down and instead of saying this is a food, it's a fish gene in a fish, we sat down and began to describe what we thought the product should be with the FDA. Their concerns were they were getting complaints from environmentalists and from outside groups saying this fish could interact and reduce biological diversity. It could breed with wild salmon. I've already told you that there aren't very many Atlantic salmon that are wild, but it's a fair concern. They were also concerned about food safety, and that's a lot easier to address. Those of you who have ever registered an animal drug, and I've registered quite a few, know that food safety is an important component, and that's a relatively easy task to do. So to address the environmental concerns, we said, our fish grows so well and grows so quickly and economically in a contained system, we will say and consider that this fish will only be grown in closed, contained, secure aquaculture facilities, tanks, if you will. And as long as it can be secured and physically contained, that will be adequate and sufficient, and the FDA can make that a condition of use. The other things that we volunteered was, in fish you can do things that you can't do in terrestrial animals. One of my favorites is you can make neomales. Neomales are genetic girls that produce sperm. It's a sex reversal that you can do in fish, amphibians, and some of the lower vertebrates. By using homozygous neomales to carry our gene and fertilize wild-type eggs, we could produce populations that were 100% female, each of which was heterozygous or hemizygous for the trait of interest. It had one copy of the AquaBounty gene construct and could be grown in physically contained systems. Those fish grew very rapidly, and when the FDA said, well, what do we do for a label claim? We said, well, how about we say that this fish grows to 100 grams faster than the comparator? That's an easy test to do. It doesn't take a long time to do. And if you saw the growth curves, it's not very hard. You can almost see the difference in the fish as you see them in the tanks because the growth rates are so different. I'm going to scroll forward 3 or 4 years later. By late 2009, early 2010, the FDA had concluded its review. They called a Veterinary Medical Advisory Committee meeting, and they issued a briefing document about 200 pages of our data. They shared this. They impaneled a panel of experts, the existing VMAC, and they added 3 experts from aquaculture and 1 from a non-governmental organization, the Center for Science and the Public Interest. They presented the review in a public meeting, and there were probably 1,000 people in the auditorium. I had an opportunity to give a short presentation. The FDA basically, section by section, went through all the technical sections and gave their conclusions in this public meeting. I've summarized them on one slide. They basically said it's an Atlantic salmon. We were thrilled to hear that. We knew that all along, but it was important for them to say that publicly. More importantly, it's identical to the traditional Atlantic salmon in every measurable respect. If you measure the composition, you measure every analyte that you can measure, and you measure all of the characteristics of that Atlantic salmon, our fish was well within all of those parameters. The only thing that was different was that it grew faster. And the other thing that could be different, or could be viewed as different, is it was all female, and it did carry that 1 extra gene. They also, in their environmental review, because of the physical containment and the redundant biological physical containment inherent in our product, concluded that our fish, if deployed under the proposed conditions of use, represented no significant risk to the environment. They issued what most of you will recognize in a term that many of the lay community find amusing. They issued a FONSI, finding of no significant impact, a draft FONSI. Interestingly, when the FDA presented their conclusions, and they spent the morning doing that, they turned the meeting over in the afternoon to the public. And groups that you're well acquainted with had their opportunity to come to the podium and make 10 to 15-minute presentations. The agency had just said the product was safe and effective and safe for the environment. Some of these groups stood up and said that if you eat this fish, it will cause cancer, it will kill you, and it will cause an apocalyptic extinction of the species. That is no exaggeration. There are people in the room who were at the meeting. It was mind-blowing to hear the difference in views. And interestingly enough, all based on the same information. All the scientists in the room, including the external consultants brought in by the FDA, had said, this is not a big deal, guys. This has been around for more than 20 years. It's the most studied fish in history, and it's probably safer than the contemporary practice. But yet the environmental groups and the food safety groups and the Center for Food Safety stood up and said, this fish will cause cancer, it will cause apocalyptic extinctions, and it will destroy the universe. And that's not hyperbole. These are the kind of comments that were made. It was amazing to sit through and to hear. I'm going to scroll forward now another 2 years. We went 2 years after that meeting, and our environmental, as you probably know, the process is the firm prepares a draft environmental assessment. The FDA is responsible for issuing its environmental assessment, and what they generally do is they take the firm's draft, and then they work with it and decide if there's anything they need to add to it. For more than 2 years, we heard nothing, and I mean nothing. We went to every agency. We went to the Domestic Policy Council. We went to the Office of Science and Technology Policy. We went to every office of the Executive Office of the President. We went to HHS. We went to USDA. And no one in our government would tell us what the status of our application was. It just went into a black hole. Then in December of 2012, we received a phone call from a gentleman named John Entine, who was writing an article. And he said to me, I have your drug approval letter. And I said, no, you don't. Yes, I do. No, you can't. There's no such thing. And he said, well, I have a document. And I said, well, what is the document? Well, I can't tell you. I got it from someone in the government. And I said, well, I can't comment on something that I haven't seen. Well, I'm writing a story, and I'll send you the draft. So he sent me the draft. The story was fascinating. The story had to do with HHS basically putting this on a shelf because there was a presidential election coming up in less than 2 years. The fear was that the president's base would be upset if they approved the world's first genetically engineered animal. And you can read this in Forbes magazine. You can read this in Slate, where John Entine published it. The most remarkable part of the story is not so much the Entine story, but the fact that 2 days after the story issued, our environmental assessment subsequently was published for public comment. Something that we couldn't do in 2 years, going door to door in every Washington agency, happened overnight when a journalist wrote an investigative story. Our worst fear was that the government would think that we'd somehow leaked this document, and we didn't. We'd honored our obligation. But someone in the government, and I still to this day don't know who, and I have no idea which agency, and perhaps it's better that way, had leaked our environmental assessment. Entine quoted an unnamed presidential advisor in a White House meeting saying, now we have nowhere to hide. I guess we'd better let the EA out. So the EA was published for public comment. What was supposed to be a 60-day comment period turned into a 120-day comment period, and that closed in April of 2013. It's now nearly a year later, and we're still waiting. We've not been asked for any new data, but we think and we hope that they're working on a regulatory approval. Some of the fun that happened in the interim, there were more than 9 legislative initiatives introduced by members of Congress to either derail, forbid, prohibit, or defund efforts to review or approve our fish. The Alaskan delegation was of particular concern because they saw us as a threat to their Pacific salmon markets. Now, Alaskan salmon, if many of you know, I hope, are marketed and branded as wild-caught. It's a different species. They're Oncorhynchus. There are 5 economic species of Alaskan salmon. It's a nice product. It's a nice industry. We're not a threat to them. The U.S. imports $2 billion worth of Atlantic salmon, which is distinct in the fish case, distinct as a product, a distinct species, and we import $2 billion worth a year from Chile, from Norway, from the Faroe Islands, Scotland, and Canada. That's the market that we hope to participate in. That 270,000 tons that's imported into the U.S. every year. Having said that, the Alaskans weren't deterred. They've fought us tooth and nail. I was even called to testify before a Senate hearing on the threat of this fish to the environment. Interestingly enough, I was the only one there who actually had read the environmental assessment. The other witnesses were people who were there to tell Senator Begich how smart and wise he was to consider this a risk. And you can read the transcript of that hearing, but the other 3 witnesses basically couldn't even address the fundamentals of the product description. Other considerations entered into this. And again, as we talk about precautionary principles, it sounds really nice when you talk about social and economic concerns. Those are not science-based, they're subjective, and they change. More importantly, it depends on who gets to do the analysis. If the sponsor gets to do the analysis, I can assure you it will probably be supportive of the product application. If the opposition gets to do the analysis, I guarantee it will not. So where do you draw the line? And whose input is more valuable? Letters to the Commissioner raised the spectrum of environmental impact studies. The FDA had already concluded in a draft assessment that a FONSI was appropriate and there was no threat. Those of you who know about environmental impact studies know that they're open-ended. They're conducted by the federal agencies. They can take a year. They can take 2 years. They can take 10 years. In principle, they can take 100 years. That's a tool that the activist community is now using and wielding against innovative new products and new technologies. The prospect of an environmental impact study will scare even the most solid supporter of a new drug application. In our case, we have a fish that has superior production characteristics. They're all female, they're sterile, they're regulated as an animal drug. That means the FDA regulates our hatchery, they regulate wherever the fish is grown out, our fish are inspected, and believe it or not, we run a GMP operation. Can you imagine validating processes with living organisms? We think we're the only people on the face of the earth that can do that. And we've had other companies come to us and ask us how they might be able to do it. Not too many, because most of them are afraid to come into this segment because of the regulatory morass. We've had more than 19 years in this regulatory process. We've been inspected by FDA more than 4 times. We've passed every one, not one single 483. We've had a 3-year delay from the VMAC. We still have no idea where our application is. We hope they're about to approve it. There was a 2-year delay in publishing the environmental assessment, apparently because it was inconvenient for the administration, and a 1-year delay since the close of the comment period. We spent more than $70 million in this time trying to develop this. I've been close to bankruptcy for 4 consecutive years. This last year was a milestone. We actually had funding through the year, and we have funding through the end of this year. But there aren't many investors who will stay with a company or a technology through this kind of a minefield. And that is perhaps the most chilling. Mark talked about technology moving offshore. We have become the poster child for that. We're the emblem. We're the first. We hope we're successful, because it's not just about us. I want to talk about one other aspect of the precautionary principle, and I've cleaned this up a little bit. The letter is real. It's a real letter. This is a segment I've crossed out the names because as I sit on this group, it's important to protect the confidentiality and the integrity of the process. And unlike some of our opponents, I have integrity and I respect confidentiality. But in this letter, this writer, who happens to be a lawyer, an influential lawyer, says how to proceed on the Biosafety Clearinghouse for risk assessment. And this is a global effort aimed at trying to derive guidance and guidelines for the regulation of what they call living modified organisms, LMOs. We call them GMOs, or we call them genetically engineered. And you can read the bias in this letter as he exhorts his moderator and the people on the committees to try to do this. Every LMO which the protocol procedures address is in front of us because of economic considerations. Some company thinks it can make money by producing and selling it. So the economic concerns of the affected parties are just as integral to assessing the overall risks, and presumably have already been one party of the company. Assessors are responsible to society, at least in democracy. That to me is hypocrisy of the first order, because he's wrapping himself in democracy and in a high-sounding ideal at the same time that he's castigating anyone who's trying to innovate and bring new technology that may indeed help feed the world. So the bias inherent in his letter and his demand that they consider social and economic consequences for introduction of new products, and this is risk assessment. This is not product approval. This is just assessing risk. To me, is not onerous, it's dangerous. And this is typical of the mentality that we see not just in the United States, not just part of the precautionary principle, but the biosafety risk assessment process has been corrupted because we've opened the doors, we've allowed everybody in, and it's gone to the least common denominator. So now there are people who want to make subjective assessments based on their views, their philosophies, and their view of how the world should work. They're the same people who think that all drugs should be free and that drugs will just come from the sky. They don't have to be developed by companies, and no one has to make an investment. And I can go on and on and on, but I won't in the interest of time. My bottom line here is that there has been a definite and demonstrable corruption of the risk assessment process, which has further complicated the regulatory process. I'll close with the competing dueling interests. On the one hand, we have science-based regulation, something that I'm committed to, and I think if we lose, we're lost. We're lost as a society. If this becomes subjective, if this becomes arbitrary, if this becomes regulation by referendum, we will never make any progress. We will be consigned to use the drugs that we have and the technologies that we have, and many of us will not eat as well in the future as we eat today. Many of our children will not have the quality of life that we have today. Transparency is a good thing. But when you throw out all the data and people corrupt, twist, and misrepresent that data, and to be honest, out and out lie about it, it is a destructive process. Risk assessment is important. We all believe in that. Every company that I work with, and every individual and every regulator believes in risk assessment. But if you corrupt the process and introduce things that are subjective and personal and emotional, you corrupt the risk assessment process. You're no longer talking about risk, you're talking about preferences. Once you do that, I believe you're lost. The risk communication. On the one hand, I go out and I talk to people. Do you know how hard it is to talk to people about triploids and all-female populations? Their eyes glaze over. They roll in the back of their heads. If you're not in an audience like this, people don't want to hear about genomes and gene sizes and gene silencing and gene activation or promoters. What they want to know is it safe? Can I eat it? Is it any good? How does it taste? So how do you address that? Especially when your opponents are out saying, if you eat this, it will kill you. It will cause cancer. It will cause apocalyptic extinction of the universe. So they exaggerate risks. They deliberately create anxiety and fear. And it's all part of that extension of the precautionary principle and that corruption of the risk assessment process. If this sounds critical and if this sounds, judgmental, yes, it is. I've lived this for the last 10 years. And we've had things done to us that were absolutely unconscionable, unprincipled, and reprehensible. I can't talk about this in the public because it makes me seem petty and angry, but I can talk about it to an educated audience because I can tell you that the life that we've lived and the story that we share, we are at risk of losing the initiative, and we're losing it to people who have a vested economic interest in the success of 19th century technology at higher prices. And we're in the 21st century, and we're facing the challenge of feeding 9 billion people. And if we're not successful, there will be consequences of that. So the economic and political interests are the potent drivers. The precautionary principle is the weapon of choice for all these folks, because after all, the first rule is do no harm. Our experience was in 1995, we opened up an INAD. We thought we'd have an approval a few years later. It's now 2014, and we're still waiting. The battle continues.